interrupt your regular programming to bring you this special presentation. As we enter this new era, we must look back and reflect on the impact of the 20th century. All through this century, the world has made many positive and negative advances, with many new advances, but at the cost of many wars. Today we will focus on the scientific and technological impact of the 20th century in Canada. We will go through World War I, the 20s and 30s, World War II, and the post-war. We shall now begin with our junior reporter, Saladin Kabir, on World War I.
The horrendous reality of war lit the sparks to an age of new technology and scientific discoveries that would change the world forever. 5 significant technological advancements that changed the face of war included the usage of tanks, poison gas, zeppelins, U-boats, and machine guns. Tanks were known as the armored chariots, the ultimate war weapon, designed to pierce through enemy lines with its firepower, steel plates, and caterpillar tracks. It came of great use, especially in conquering no man's land. At Ypres, the Germans triggered the sparks to the controversial usage of chemical warfare. Chlorine, mustard, and phosphine gases were used by the dirty Germans. These gases would burn the insides of troops of both sides, causing numerous casualties. In the air, besides the flying dogfighters, the Germans were busy making zeppelins, blimps that flew in the sky and bombarded enemy cities and towns. A local bluebird shares her remarks on the bombardments of the zeppelins at the war front.
Hi, my name is Coraline Smith. I'm 24 years old and I'm a bluebird for the CEF. ATOPS was one of the most horrible cases where 3 sisters lost life under a heavy zeppelin bombardment. Their civilian slaughtering was so traumatizing, it scared the hoochies out of me.
We take you now underwater, where those creative Germans came up with submarines called U-boats that terrorized the waters of the Atlantic throughout the war. Tell us, Officer Branson, how did it feel to be attacked by those U-boats?
They would be coming at you from nowhere. You always got to be on your tiptoes.
Finally, the land machine of all artilleries came the machine guns. These deadly weapons accommodated for almost half of the casualties during the trench warfare. Closely packed troops were the initial targets that faced hails of more than 100 bullets, tearing them to pieces round after round. These arsenals were put together to great use on the ground and in the air. Now, the 20s and 30s.
New inventions like the battery-less radio, the mass production of the Ford Model T automobile, and the discovery of insulin revolutionized the 20th century. Here we have Edward Rogers, a brilliant Canadian inventor, tell us more about the radio. Mr. Rogers?
Thank you, Junaid. The radio was a great technological invention, as it made the world seem smaller. It ended isolation and brought cheap entertainment to people's homes. The first radio had a quartz crystal where listeners were moving to locate the desired location. There were no speakers, so earphones were needed and used rechargeable batteries. Eventually, tubes replaced the quartz crystals and speakers replaced the earphones. By 1925, I discovered a way of plugging the radio directly into the electrical socket. It meant that radios could use electricity instead of rechargeable batteries. By 1929, approximately 1/3 of Canadian households owned a radio, tuning to sports, weather, music, comedies, and so much more without the need for speakers or the worry of recharging the battery.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. The Ford Model T was significant in shaping the 20th century. The mass production of the car on the assembly line meant that the car would be cheaper and almost anyone could afford it. It allowed people to get from place to place without having to worry about a broken wagon or a cart wheel. Unfortunately, Henry Ford was able to make it for an interview, so we have a short clip about the Ford Model T.
Of all the automobiles that have ever been designed and built in the world, there's one that stands out as most significant above them all, and that's the Model T Ford. The Model T introduced mass production and single-handedly brought us from a horse and buggy level of technology to one where we had machines that were run by gasoline engines. Using a moving assembly line, Henry Ford was able to build these things in about 1/10 the time it took to build other vehicles by hand previous to the Model T. The Model Ts were simple, they were rugged, they were cheap, and as Henry Ford used to say, you can have any color you want as long as it's black. When they were first introduced in 1909, they sold for $950, which doesn't sound like much to us today. Back then, that was quite a lot of money. Henry Ford cleverly paid his employees $5 a day, which back then was a huge amount of money compared to other jobs that they could get. He also reduced their workday from 9 to 8 hours, but again, by doing that, he could have 3 production shifts working, and hence build cars around the clock. All of this was going on at a time of economic difficulty and transition, and so the result of this is people would come from all over the country to get jobs working in Detroit at the auto factories, and of course their job of choice was with Ford. Production of the Model A's went for 19 years, from 1908 to 1928, and the last ones were built that weren't very much different from the very first ones that he originally produced. They had wooden spoked wheels with metal rims pressed on them. You can see here what they're doing is hand filing the spokes to make them smooth so they can be painted. The engine was a ridiculously simple, by today's standard, and light 177 cubic inch, which is 2.9 liter, 4-cylinder engine, which produced 20 horsepower. The vehicle weighed about 1,200 pounds, depending on which body style you got, and would be good for about 40 to 45 mile an hour top speed, and it had 2 forward gears. The assembly line was split so that the frame and the wheels and tires and everything were assembled at one point, and then the bodies were assembled separately, and then at one point the body would be dropped onto the frame. Over the years, an enormous number of body styles were created. You had a touring car, a roadster pickup, a ton truck, a closed cab ton truck, a coupe, a 2-door, a 4-door, a center door, a station wagon, and a convertible. Pretty versatile vehicle. Eventually the Model T was replaced by a Model A, which was a modernized, stylized version of a vehicle that looked quite the same. Highland Park was the first modern assembly plant, and it's where the Model Ts were produced. And just like today, when they're done being assembled, they're driven off the assembly line. But look at these vehicles as they come out. Look at all the different body styles, many of which we read, and these are all just different versions of Model Ts. Finally, after 19 years of production, Henry Ford had actually built almost 15.5 million Model Ts, and they were by far the most popular and most plentiful vehicle on the road. And here you can see the assembly of the 15 millionth, which is a 4-door convertible model. And as you can see, they've added some paint colors other than just black, and that actually is Henry Ford there driving off the assembly line and driving in that 15 millionth Model T Ford. This particular one hadn't gone through final assembly quality control. You can see how Henry had to give a little nudge there to get it shut properly. To start a Model T, you had to hand crank it, but because the engine wasn't very big and it was low compression, all it would take was about a half a turn and it would fire right up. Back then, riding in a car was an occasion. It was a big excursion. It was fun. Just the ride itself was quite entertaining. Keep in mind that going somewhere in a car was probably 10 times faster than going by horse or buggy, which is what they were accustomed to before. Back then, cities were just developing, and most of the roads were terrible, especially the country roads. And so the Model T had to be built in such a way where it could handle anything, all the way from no road to city roads, and it actually did a very good job of that. Most of the country roads were mud roads or dirt roads, and in the city there was no snow plows. If it flooded, you had to ford it, and so you just had to deal with all the stuff, and the Model T was miraculous at being able to handle almost any road condition you could imagine. So here you've got the original Ford Model T, the great-great-great-grandparent of most every car you see on the road.
Here alongside us we have Dr. Frederick Benton. He, along with Charles Best, developed insulin from dogs that diabetics used worldwide to treat their diabetes since 1922. He has since been recognized worldwide, and his discovery significantly shaped the 20th century. Dr. Benton?
I studied diabetes because the only treatments were strict exercise regimes and starvation diets, which were ineffective because thousands of diabetics face blindness and limb amputations. I believed that I could isolate insulin in animals and use it to treat diabetics. Charles Best and I tested the insulin by injecting into a 14-year-old who was suffering from diabetes and weighed only 30 kilos. After the injection, his blood sugar levels dropped and he gained strength. What I have to say about insulin is that insulin is not a cure for diabetes, it's a treatment. It enables the diabetic to burn sufficient carbohydrates so that proteins and fats may be added to provide energy for the economic burdens of life. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Benting. After many years of great economic times where there were many technological advances in the 1920s, the crash that shook the world, Black Tuesday, the mark of the beginning of the Great Depression, the technological advances halted.
After the stock market crashed, people were selling all their stock shares because they were so afraid of losing their money. So sales fell, less money was circulating. There was less demand than supply decreased, and eventually businesses would shut down. Without a circulation of wealth, there was not enough money to finance the research and development for technological advancements. Thus, there was no technological advancements during the Great Depression. But everything changed when Adolf Hitler attacked.
Thank you, Prime Minister Bennett. And that's all we have for the 1920s and 30s. Now on for the continuation of the story with our senior historian reporter, Hamza.
Thank you, Junaid. During the war's early years, Canada was on the receiving end of all the microwave radar developments supplied by Britain. Canada, in return, sent nearly 9,000 radar sets to the Allies, which was worth hundreds of millions of dollars in today's currency. At one point during the war, the National Research Council built submarine detection in the St. Lawrence River in a matter of 7 days. Early on in the war, Canada encouraged its citizens to gain knowledge in the fields of technology and science, which led us to produce many electricians to support Britain's ailing demand of these workers. Aside from the radar, many other technological developments took place in the Second World War. One would be the Canadian anti-acoustic torpedo, which was gear that was developed to counter enemy acoustic torpedoes. This invention was credited for saving the forces from torpedo attacks. Here we have a guest, George Klein, to speak about the developments which contributed to the war.
Thank you, Hamza. The war, as you may know, was a time where deaths were many and families were sorrowful. Along with a few scientists at my side, we knew we would have to reduce this somehow. Our first invention provided a means of testing and quantifying snow conditions, so the soldiers were aware of what was coming their way. We had also developed the aiming systems for artillery, which made it easier to scope out a target. Many other developments were made which I felt gave our nation a path to success, and that gave me a feeling of pride. Hamza?
Thank you, George. You're truly a hero. Now we'll be moving on to our chief historian, Peter Medema, with the post-war.
After the war, Canada still continued to make scientific advances in the military field. We made many different types of new ships and airplanes. A large Canadian company named Avro Canada invented new airplanes and changed people's beliefs on what planes could do. They designed planes, the Avro C-102 jetliner and the CF-100 jet fighter. One of their most notable projects was the Avro CF-105 Aero. This plane was unique because it was one of the first supersonic planes and at the time was the fastest plane in the world, able to reach speeds of Mach 2 and upwards. This invention was a huge milestone in Canada's scientific past, helping forge us as a powerful nation with a large scientific impact. During these times, we continued to invent various products and launched our first satellite. We went on to launch a series of satellites such as the Alouette 1, Alouette 2, as well as the Black Brant. We also went on to invent other small inventions, such as the alkaline and lithium batteries that you still use in your everyday products to this day. All of these were Canadian inventions that had large impacts on not just us, but the world, bringing Canada to the forefront of a worldwide stage. So there you have it, from World War I all the way to the post-era, a detailing of Canada's scientific and technological impact on the 20th century. I, Peter Medema, on behalf of all my reporters, hope you leave this presentation feeling a little bit more educated and proud to be a Canadian.
I do whatever you like, I do whatever you like.